Yeah. And what a joy it is to have. I know we get a lot of superfluous and a lot of great big adjectives used at us on a regular basis, but we just really do have some of the finest musicians in Birmingham. And I am so grateful. So grateful. So, today marks the beginning of 4 weeks where we're going to be talking about essentially the same thing. And I know some of you are like, okay, well, I'll come back in 5 weeks. But what we're going to start today is something that is as important as anything you're ever going to hear in this building. And again, that may seem like a superlative, but it's the truth. Forgiveness is one of the foundational pieces of work that we as human beings have to learn to do if we are ever going to advance spiritually. You know, I've been thinking about a question that was asked in our Wednesday night class the week before last about what does a spiritual program look like? And I think that if I had to describe what I'm going to be teaching probably for the entire time that I'm here, the spiritual program would be based on 4 main things. The first one would be about communicating with Spirit, and that would involve prayer, meditation, and journaling. Maybe also doing what we would call confession work, being able to talk your stuff out with another human being, and that comes from a couple different disciplines, both the Catholic Church and the way it was intended to be, and in the 12 steps. I think that the 4 T's, learning how to give, tithing of your time, your talent, and your treasure, that's another one of the big 4 pieces that I teach and I think serve us when we practice those things. It's funny, all these things have 4s in them. The 4 agreements, which is essentially about being in integrity with life, right? Being impeccable with your word, not taking things personally, not making assumptions, and doing your best. And then this work, the path of forgiveness. Being able to forgive is so vitally important. So, if we take a look at forgiveness the way that Desmond Tutu does, one of the things he said about it that struck me was, forgiveness is nothing less than the way we heal the world. We heal the world by healing each and every one of our hearts. The process is simple, but it is not easy. For those of us who've been in recovery, we've heard simple but not easy a lot of times. So, when we look at when I'm being asked to forgive, what is it I'm being asked to let go of? And for a lot of us, we can bring things to mind. They're like, yeah, okay, I can forgive all this stuff, but that thing right there, I'm not going to forgive that. Right? That was just too much. The work that the Tutus did with South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was landmark in that not only did it really get this methodology and refine it and get it to be something that they could share. And he shared it all over the world, everywhere from Rwanda to Ireland. And in this really excellent book, The Book of Forgiving. And if you haven't gotten it, we've got some copies in the bookstore. You can certainly get it on Kindle, which I hope you get through smile.amazon.com and use us as your selected charity. But when we think, oh, gee, I could forgive everything except, I just want to give you an example of the kind of healing work that is possible when we do this. And I will tell you in advance, some of this particular story I'm going to share is a little difficult to listen to. He had many wounds. She spoke with the precision of a coroner. In the upper abdomen were 5 wounds. These wounds indicated that different weapons were used to stab him, or a group of people stabbed him. Mrs. Umlawuli continued her harrowing testimony to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She spoke about the disappearance and murder of her husband, Cicelo. In the lower part, he also had wounds. In total, there were 43. They poured acid on his face. They chopped off his right hand just below the wrist I don't know what they did with that hand. A wave of horror and nausea rose in me. Now it was 19-year-old Babalwa's turn to speak. She was 8 when her father died. Her brother was only 3. She described the grief, police harassment, and hardship in the years since her father's death. And then she said, I would love to know who killed my father. So would my brother. Her next words stunned me and left me breathless. We want to forgive them. We want to forgive, but we don't know who to forgive. What that led Archbishop Tutu and his daughter to understand was that there are 2 simple truths. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. Those are difficult to swallow, but they're the truth. I'd like for us to affirm those 2 truths together. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven. Together, there is nothing that cannot be forgiven. There is no one undeserving of forgiveness. Together, there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. You may not believe those words as they're coming out of your mouth right now. But what I'm hoping is that over the next month and beyond, if you choose to make a practice of this simple 4-step path, that you will come to understand that there is nothing that cannot be forgiven, no matter how horrifying, and no one undeserving of forgiveness, no matter what they've done. So I'd like to hear in Bishop Desmond Tutu's own words why we practice forgiveness. And Barry's going to play a short video for us of his.
Say, for instance, someone slaps me. The physical pain of the slap is a thing that lasts for a very short while. But if I keep the pain of having been belittled with me all the time, then it is as if that slap is eternal, as it were. And really, forgiveness is setting me free from the anguish that I cause myself by the memory of what has happened to me.
It's a very simple example, being slapped in the face. But it applies across the board, no matter how brief or how lengthy the violation may have been. We may be talking about our entire childhood. We may be talking about one moment. But when we continue to hang on to those slights, those harms, those egregious things that have been done, the pain continues to come at us and at us and at us. He says in the book, without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who harmed us, which is probably the last thing any of us wants, right? We are bound with chains of bitterness, tied together, trapped. Until we can forgive the person who harmed us, that person will hold the keys to our happiness. That person will be our jailer. When we forgive, we take back control of our own fate and our own feelings. We become our own liberators. We don't forgive to help the other person. We don't forgive for others. We forgive for ourselves. Forgiveness, in other words, is the best form of self-interest. This is true spiritually and scientifically. I remember a friend who attended Unity of Santa Barbara. And no matter what class we were doing, no matter, what was going on, she would continue to bring up the abuse that she suffered at her parents' hands and how it made her feel and how difficult it was to live with. Now, she was a few years older than I was, so at the time she was probably about the age I am now. Probably, I'm 58. She's probably somewhere in that range. And I don't think her parents were alive anymore. And she would actually say things like, when we would talk about releasing, letting go, I actually heard her say, "You don't understand. I was abused." Well, I do understand. But the perpetrators are long gone. And when we hang on to that, the only person abusing us is us. Amen? It's up to us to learn to let go. And as he points out, that letting go has been proven both spiritually and scientifically to be good for us. It's actually good for our health to forgive. There have been a lot of studies, and they cite some of them in that work, and I've looked at a few of them online, where the unforgiveness that we carry, the anger, the bitterness, the resentment turns into stress. And as we all know, stress kills, right? It can affect your heart, your liver, your lungs, all your autoimmune system. There are any number of things that can happen to us when we do not let go of unforgiveness. And the opposite is true. When we forgive, when we let go of anger, when we let go of resentment, and we allow ourselves to heal, that peace can actually reverse some of the symptoms from the problems that have been created by the stress to begin with. I've told you all a lot about my friend Walter, who was my first connection to Birmingham. He's buried over in Bessemer right now. And I know for a fact that it was his unforgiveness that put him in that plot of ground. And the last time I spoke with him, I begged him to let go of what was going on between he and his wife and to focus on his relationship with his children. And he never spoke to me again. Forgiveness offers us real freedom from the past. But we have to be willing to give it freely. See, a lot of times when we want to forgive, but we want something in return, right? We want them to say they were sorry. That's the most common thing. We want them to make it right, maybe. Not just say you're sorry, but, show me. Give me back that thing you took. Restore that thing that you broke or you destroyed. Make it right. But the problem with that is that now takes the control of the forgiveness from us and it gives it back to that other person. Right? And as Bishop Tutu says, the problem is that the strings that we attach to the gift of forgiveness become the chains that bind us to the person who harmed us. The one who offers forgiveness as a grace is immediately untethered from the yoke that bound him or her to the person who caused the harm. If we are simply willing to say, you know what, I just forgive you, that puts us back in control. That lets us release it. That lets us break the chain. Forgiveness heals families and communities. Most of you have heard of the Hatfields and McCoys, and that's a little north of here. But it's interesting how that all started. In 1865, Asa McCoy was murdered. Jim Vance, who was the uncle of Devil Anse Hatfield, was suspected of the crime but never brought to trial. So then 13 years later, an argument developed over the ownership of a hog. And then the feud escalated after Rosanna McCoy began an affair with Johns Hatfield, who was Devil Anse's son. She left her family to live with the Hatfields in West Virginia. Between 1880 and 1891, the family feud boiled over, and more than a dozen members of those two families were killed. They stopped fighting each other in 1891, and the last trial associated with that feud was 10 years later in 1901. In 1979, their descendants came together to appear on the TV show Family Feud. I'll bet that was an interesting episode. But then finally, a formal reconciliation occurred in 2003 with a peace treaty signed by both families in Pikeville, Kentucky, more than a century later. Doesn't have to be quite that overblown, but I think most of us probably know of some kind of family feud where, maybe dad doesn't talk to his sister. We don't know that side of the family. We don't know those cousins. And then not knowing them cuts them off from us. And because, we tend to not live down the block from our families anymore, even the ones we really love a whole lot. My sister and I are just thick as thieves, and she's in Burbank, California. We lose those people. We lose them from our lives. And those are connections that could feed us so much if we only knew how to forgive. So we forgive so that we don't suffer physically or mentally. And I talked about he says the corrosive effects of holding on to anger and resentment. To not forgive leads to bitterness and hatred. Like self-hatred and self-contempt, hatred of others gnaws away at our vitals. Whether hatred is projected out or stuffed in, it's always corrosive to the human spirit. It's like the old saying, resentment is like taking poison and drinking it to try to make the other person die. It's just going to hurt us. We're all connected. We're all one. You remember when I read, and then we all talked about the principles of unity. God is in all things. We are all connected through that one principle. If God is in me and God is in you and God is in everyone, we are all one. So ultimately, forgiveness is a choice that we make from the recognition that we are all one in humanity. And again, finally, forgiveness is a gift that we give to ourselves. Scarlett Lewis's son, Jesse, was killed in the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. At first, she said that her anger sapped all of her strength and energy. She was angry at the shooter and at the mother for unwittingly arming him. But then she made the choice to forgive. She told the Forgiveness Project, "Forgiveness felt like I was given a big pair of scissors to cut the tie and regain my personal power. It started with a choice and then became a process." She urged mourners at Jesse's funeral to change their angry thoughts into loving ones, that thereby they might change the world. So with an idea of what forgiveness is, we want to take a quick look at what it's not. So Barry, if you could play that second video of Bishop Tutu.
I think that many reckon that you are letting someone off the hook or condoning what has happened, and they might think that it is something that sets the other person free, whereas it is we ourselves who are being set free. And they might reckon too that it's maybe a gift that you are giving to the other person, whereas it is a gift that comes to you.
So forgiveness, it's not a free pass. It doesn't mean that we say, okay, it was okay that you did what you just did to me. It does not subvert justice. And this one sentence that he wrote really appealed to me. He says, it creates a space for justice to be enacted with a purity of purpose that does not include revenge. I like that. Justice does not necessarily include, it really doesn't include revenge. Now, in South Africa, what they did was they actually did offer amnesty to people who came forward to say, yes, I did this, please forgive me. But in some of the other countries he's worked in, like Northern Ireland, he actually went and worked with people who were being either still in prison or were being released from prison for crimes that they had committed, but in addition to having paid their debt to society, they wanted to be forgiven. And he worked with them and their victims or the families of their victims to start the cycle of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not forgetting. And as we'll see when we take a look at the cycle of forgiveness, it actually requires remembering the hurt, which is difficult. And I admit that that's difficult. But it means not forgetting the harm. You don't deny the harm. It doesn't mean that you pretend the harm didn't happen or that it wasn't as bad as it was or that it was somehow okay. It's not okay. But in order to actually forgive, that whole cycle of forgiveness can only be activated and completed in truth and honesty. Forgiveness isn't quick, just like grief isn't. And in some ways, they're very connected because ultimately it's acceptance that we get to at the end of both of these processes. Maybe the most important thing is essentially a restating of what those two truths that we talked about at the very beginning. There's nobody beyond redemption, and nothing is unforgivable. One of the things he points out is that when we say, well, but that person's a monster, we not only deny their humanity, but we take away their accountability for their actions. When we talk about somebody being like a Hitler or a Pol Pot or some of those other people in history that have done just horrific things, we call them monsters. It makes it difficult to understand how we can say, yes, they're human, but the truth is, they genuinely are. What we need to do is decide. We need to decide how we're going to deal with the harms that have been done to us. And we essentially have two choices. We can either go through the forgiveness cycle or we can go through the revenge cycle. And Barry, if you'd bring that slide up for me. Over the next few weeks, this is what we're going to be talking about. And we're going to go deeply into how this works. But it all begins in that square in the middle, and it may be difficult to read because it's cursive and they don't teach that anymore. But it says hurt, harm, loss. That's the thing, the incident that happens. Somebody hurt us. We suffer a harm. We suffer a loss. It creates pain. That's the next thing down there. And then the paths diverge. In the military, we'd call that a decision point. Right? And we can either choose to go into revenge or into forgiveness. Now, what's very common is to go into the revenge cycle. And the first thing we do is we choose to harm them back because they harmed us. In order to be able to do that, we have to reject our shared humanity. Somehow we have to say, that person's not me. That person's not God. That person's not good. And they deserve some payback. I'm going to retaliate against them. I'm going to get some revenge, which is the next part of that cycle. Well, once we've decided we're going to have our revenge, we're going to retaliate, we go back up to the top there, and we've created some violence or some kind of cruelty because we figure that's what's going to get the job done. That's how we're going to get our revenge. That violence and cruelty then lead to hurt, harm, and loss, and it all starts over again. And if you want to see an actual live demonstration of this, you have only to look at the Middle East over the last 3,000 years to see it. Now, what happens when we follow the other path? We get that hurt, harm, and loss. We feel that pain, but instead of choosing to harm, we choose to heal. This is the fourfold path of forgiveness. The first thing we have to do is tell the story. We have to get it out of us. one of the very difficult things, especially for some very personal traumas, we don't want to tell anybody. We don't want to, people don't want to tell me, their minister. They don't want to tell their therapist. They don't want to tell their best friends. They don't want to tell anybody. They just want to bury that stuff, bury it deep, and then bury the shovel. That is not healthy. All right? The first thing that we have to do is tell the story, and we keep telling it until we get it out of us. And as a part of telling that story, then we name the hurt. What specifically was that thing that happened? Where was the actual ouch? Right? It's not just enough to tell the doctor, I was in a car accident. It's like, and my arm is broken. We got to name the hurt. All right? Once we've told the story and named the hurt, then recognizing our shared humanity with that person who hurt us, we grant forgiveness. And this may be a long process, and we may have to go back to it over and over a few times. That's okay. It's like with grief. Sometimes you go backwards and forwards. You think you're in acceptance, and the next thing you know, you're angry again. That's okay. It takes what it takes. And then finally, we make the choice to either renew or release the relationship. Just because you forgive somebody does not give them a free pass back into your life. And just because you don't give them a free pass back into your life doesn't mean you didn't forgive them no matter what they think. Amen? Okay. So that's the fourfold path. And now you'll notice that the arrow kind of goes out the other way because we're not creating another hurt, harm, or loss when we forgive. Now what will happen is that at some point somebody else is going to hurt or harm us, or we're going to suffer another loss, and then we'll walk that thing through the forgiveness process, but we won't be going back and creating more hurts, harms, and losses the other way. Make sense? So next week, we're going to be talking about the first two parts of the path, which is telling your story and naming the hurt, and I hope that you will all come back and join us for that. This is important work. We're going to be talking about this on Wednesday night. We're doing a potluck class, so if you're not coming Wednesday night because you need to eat dinner at the end of the day, grab something, bring it, and we'll all break bread together, and we'll talk more detail and in more depth about this stuff, and then next week on Sunday we'll get started on the actual process itself. Thank you for joining me and for sitting still for this. This is difficult stuff. Some of it's difficult to hear. Some of it brings things up in us that we would rather not remember, but I promise you, if you learn the process of forgiveness, it will serve your mind, it will serve your body, and it will serve your spirit. Thank you. Please join me for a moment of prayer. Sweet Spirit, in this hour, we have taken a look at what it means to forgive. And we remember what our brother and way shower, Jesus, told us when asked if we should forgive someone who has harmed us. He said, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. We recognize that shared humanity in our brothers and sisters, and we make the solemn vow that we will go forward from this place in the light of that Christ and in that discipline our brother taught us to forgive and forgive and forgive again. Thank you, sweet Spirit. So it is.